So this is our official beginning. Welcome to week 2 of West Michigan's slow read of Mansfield Park. And today we're talking about chapters 7 through 12 to deepen our knowledge of the novel of primary characters and their interrelations, which we had a good start on last week. Before we get started, let me make a quick reminder about spoilers. We're not looking beyond chapter 12 tonight, and we'll document exactly what we know, and with as much detail as we get, know or suspect to date. Last week, it worked well just to remain unmuted unless there was a reason to mute, to block out outside noise. But please literally raise your hand if you're having difficulty getting in, or under reactions, you can use the raised hand icon. I don't see reaction. Oh yeah, there it is right now. So anyway, anytime really, please share bits of humor, oddities, even right up front, something that just didn't make sense to you. Usually that's a clue towards something that might actually make a difference. Okay, tonight, because I mentioned free and direct discourse, aka FID, in the material that has gone out tonight, let's just, in any old order, see whether we can come up with some quick examples. If any of you marked something, please jump in. Otherwise, I have 2 or 3 examples of noticing when the detached narrator, though we'll be finding out that our narrative voice in Mansfield Park doesn't always seem so detached. Do you remember that when the seating is worked out for going to Southerton, she says something like, "Happy Julia, unhappy Mariah." So the narrative voice is commenting and seems engaged in ways that are sometimes unusual. But the free and direct discourse is a very particular development in fiction that Austen was extremely important in sharing, where we have an example of the melding of a kind of detached narrator's voice and the inner life of characters. Does anybody have an example you'd like to share that would be kind of easy for us to find?
I do.
Good. What page?
Well, I don't have your.
Okay, what chapter?
It's the first. It's in chapter 7.
Okay, first line of the paragraph.
It's in the middle of. It's near the end of the paragraph, and it's when Miss Crawford is talking about Edmund, in how she says that she finds him. She could not foreseen that she would find him pleasant because he wasn't a very pleasant person by any common definition. He talked no nonsense. He paid no compliments. His opinions were unbending. His attentions tranquil and simple. There was a charm, perhaps, in his sincerity and his steadiness. So,
yeah, good example.
It's like, well, that's actually trying very hard to find something good about him.
Yeah. In fact, her attitudes are changing. Remember, first she thought she should be interested in Tom Bertram, the heir to the estate, but she's discovering little by little as we're going along, she really likes Edmund better. That's about on the 3rd page of chapter 7. There's a long paragraph starting, "A young woman pretty lively with a harp." And it's at the end of that. So you might want to take a look at that. But then look at the very next paragraph, since we're there. "Fanny could not wonder that Edmund was at the parsonage every morning. She would gladly have been there too, might she have gone in uninvited and unnoticed to hear the harp. Neither could she wonder that when the evening stroll was over and the 2 families parted again, he should think it right to attend Mrs. Grant and her sister to their home, while Mr. Crawford was devoted to the ladies of the park. But she thought it a very bad exchange." Can you hear Fanny coming through in this? Mm-hmm. But it's not an interior monologue. The narrator, in fact, is probably interposing something like, "Fanny did not wonder." That probably doesn't come from her. If Edmund were not there to mix the wine and water, she would rather go without it than not. She was a little surprised that he could spend so many hours with Miss Crawford and not see more of the sort of fault which he had already observed, and of which she was almost always reminded by something of the same nature. So there's quite a long episode there of free and direct discourse. There are other times when we'll get indirect dialogue. And there's a great example at one point. We'll try to put our finger on it later. But at least one more quick peek here. This time in chapter 8, in the Penguin, it's 76 and a third. In chapter 8, it's actually toward the end, and a paragraph beginning, for the first 7 miles, Miss Bertram had very little real comfort. You see that? Okay, if you have the paragraph about 7 or 8 lines down, when Julia looked back, it was with a countenance of delight, and whenever she spoke to them, it was in the highest spirits, her view of the country, etc. But her only offer of exchange, that's not quite what I meant. Oh, I look at the beginning of that paragraph. I think it was Miss Bertram. For the first 7 miles, Miss Bertram had very little real comfort. Her prospect always ended in Mr. Crawford and her sister sitting side by side, full of conversation and merriment. That's Mariah's observation. And to see only his expressive profile as he turned with a smile to Julia, or to catch the laugh of the other, that was a perpetual source of irritation. If you can find your way back to chapter 7, that page at 62, where we were reading both of those other examples, I want to draw something else to our attention. That especially in chapter 7, when Jane Austen is really guiding us as readers, she uses italics a lot. Have you noticed that?
Mm-hmm.
She won't throughout the whole book. Every now and then she will, for emphasis, and to slow her reader down a little, to pay attention. We were looking at that paragraph, Fanny could not wonder. And I think I read the part a little on, could not see more of the fault which he had already observed, and of which she, meaning Fanny, was almost always reminded. Look down to about 4 or 5 lines from the bottom of that paragraph. And the offer of the mare, the horse, to Mary has come up. No pain, no injury, however, was designed by Edward to his cousin in this offer. She was not to lose a day's exercise by it, etc. And if you flip just a couple of pages, I think it's right in here. A couple of pages, see Fanny's answer was extremely civil. Beginning of the paragraph. 2 lines, or the paragraph, no part of it fatigues me. It's 2 lines up from the beginning of that one. This is when Fanny and Edmund, or Mary and Edmund, have shown up, and who's saying, I wish you may not be fatigued by so much exercise. I wish you, who's Edmund talking about? I wish you may not be fatigued by so much exercise. I wish you had saved yourself this walk home. No part of it fatigues me. He's talking to Mary, right?
Right, yes.
Yeah,
yes,
okay.
Miss Crawford.
Exactly. And there are a lot of she's and you's, keeping it straight. Back where we were before, where Mrs. Norris starts speaking, it's on my 67. That is a very, very foolish trick, Fanny. Do you see that paragraph?
Oh, when she's sitting on the sofa?
Yep, to be idling away all evening upon a sofa. Why cannot you come and sit here and employ yourself as we do? Then turn a page. We hear Fanny was cutting roses. There was certainly no help for it, rejoined Mrs. Norris. See that paragraph? But I question whether her headache might not be caught then, sister, meaning when she was working for Mrs. or Lady Bertram and not for her. And so anyway, if you just go on flipping through her desire, etc., etc. So enough about italics and examples of fid. But is everybody pretty clear on that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Then let's back up.
I have one question.
Oh, yeah. Good.
Okay.
Hop right in.
I probably, it was in the beginning of the book, but I can't remember. Why was Fanny's health so bad? Why was she so fragile?
Oh, you know what? We're not told explicitly about that, but what are your guesses? What are your surmises?
Malnourishment.
Yeah,
Yeah,
starting in life.
probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Fanny lived her first 10 years with her family in Portsmouth. And we've learned a little bit about that, not a lot, more will be coming. But in chaos And if you've read ahead, you know a lot more about that, what that was like. But she also, I mean, some people just don't have the same energy and gumption as others. Susan?
Could it have been that they perceived her to be more frail because she was so shy and reticent and kind of withdrawn?
Maybe, but we do learn that she fatigues easily, right? It's not Mary Crawford who needs Edmund's concern about fatigue. Anything else along that line to clear up right now?
One thing I thought about, because I was thinking about this, why, after she's had good food for the last 8 years, why isn't she stronger than she used to be? And then I'm thinking, well, Lady Bertram is like this. She's very, very unmoving and lethargic. And maybe there's a tendency in the family.
Maybe
I have
genetics.
no idea, you know?
There was a great description in the chapters last week about Lady indolent.
Indolent, yep, that's the
No
word.
interest in her daughter's education. She was only interested in herself.
Yep, on the couch with her pug.
Yes.
Yes, and so if we, Allison just I think someone, just about poor nutrition. But also what comes up in this chapter that would cause her not to be in such great health and to be fatigued? The horse. Let's talk about the horse.
The horse. Well, yes,
she doesn't get,
she
maybe
rides
she
for her
doesn't,
health.
you know, how much exercise does Fanny get? She never rode a horse before. It is, I think maybe she's not as weak as it is a character trait that we need in order for her to get stronger.
You mean as a progression through the novel, a deliberate thing by Austen?
Because once she starts riding the horse, that takes a lot of energy and strength.
It does.
Yeah, it helps.
But when they're at Southerton, she sits. They leave her to sit for an hour and a half.
And she's the one who initiates that. But she thinks they'll be back in a few minutes, of course. But she's the one who needed Edmund's arm and who then said, I'm tired, I need to sit down. I need to find a place to sit down. So it's definitely something about Fanny. And we can
Fanny never goes anywhere.
Well,
Fanny
is that part of it?
Yeah.
She's bored.
Yeah, she walks through the house, right? And rides when she has the horse to ride, but she doesn't visit the other people in the area. She just sits at home.
Yeah.
Taking care of Mrs. Bertram.
Right.
Putting up with Aunt Norris. Yeah.
Oh, God.
Okay. Well, what do we actually learn as we go through this chapter 7, the horse section? What do we learn about all three characters? We've already learned that, well, Fanny and Edmund start chapter 7 by analyzing Mary Crawford. Well, Fanny, how do you like Miss Crawford now? And Fanny has a few things to say about gratitude, and that we might want to come back with because Fanny and gratitude becomes a real issue. But Fanny also brings up, she talks about the impropriety of her talk about her uncle, the admiral. They agree about that. Short letters to her brother, all that. But what happens by the end of this conversation? How does Edmund respond to her?
Well, they agree that Mary Crawford has been improper, and it's important that they agree. And Edmund is kind of quizzing her. You know, he's her master in some ways, like tutor. And you know, he starts the conversation, right? He's like, "So, what did you think?" And at first, she says all this pleasant stuff, and then she says, and he says, "But did you think anything else?" He's like, "Well, I thought some of it was improper." And he's like, yes, that's the right answer. I thought you would think that. So,
but then,
when he's there, he's under her spell.
Right.
He's totally under her spell.
Right.
And everything she does is just wonderful. And he completely forgets about Fanny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Fanny is very obliging. oh, she can have the horse, I'll sit here and wait for you people to come back. She's just extremely obliging, and
She fades
Edmund's
into the
just off
sofa.
doing what he wants to do. He's
She-
totally entranced by this lady.
Fanny fades into the sofa
Oh, yes.
or into the bench and
Mhm.
doesn't insert herself
Right.
until she's asked at this time.
And even when she's asked, she just agrees with whatever he wants.
She's
Oh, she can have
she's
the horse.
Lainey,
Hmm.
did you have something to say?
No, I was agreeing. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Fanny tries to get his attention to say something negative about Mary Crawford besides the uncle, which he attributes to her education. In fact, that she has not had the right kind of gender education and model, perhaps even her aunt is responsible for some of what she knows and how she acts. But she really tries to get Edmund's attention in that it's like on the second page of chapter 7, end of a paragraph. And what right had she to suppose that you would not write long letters when you were absent? That's a very important matter to Fanny, and she tries to defend Edmund. And what does he say? The right of a lively mind, Fanny. That paragraph is exceedingly important because Edmund has clearly thought about this. She's not ill-humored. He makes lots of distinctions. So that's a good place for us to kind of start where we are with that. But we're certainly told that Miss Crawford's attractions didn't lessen, et cetera, et cetera. We get into the horse business. Oh, we talked about Mary Crawford, that piece of free and direct discourse, did not think very much about it. But there's something going on here between Mary and Edmund, trying to kind of make more explicit what they feel about each other. We know that Fanny doesn't think as much of the charm of the Crawfords as everyone else appears to. Okay, what about the horse? What do you remember from that section? And what do we then learn as a next step about all three characters?
We see how selfish Mary Crawford is.
Mhm.
In fact, the thing that got me is talking about how Edmund's under her spell when she has the horse and personally comes back to return it. And she says, your selfishness must always be forgiven, because there's no hope of a cure. And then the other line, nothing ever fatigues me but doing what I do not like. I can't imagine that Edmund would really care for someone who would say such things, except she has such a lively mind and a beautiful face that she can get away with it.
Yeah.
And she's perfectly feminine, according to him as well.
Just jumping ahead just a little bit. Oh, I just blanked out. Oh, remember at the end of the, I can't remember which chapter it is right now, but when they're stopped by the ha-ha and Fanny sits down when they're wandering in the wilderness, and we're told that, Edmund is teasing her about how far they've walked and all this stuff. And we're told it was an engaging flirtation, basically. So her wit and her charm, even when they're tussling like that, is something that charms Edmund. And we'll see what characters have been a little blind and when as we continue going along. So then she rides the horse, she's showing off a little bit. Even here's more evidence about Fanny's health. Remember when she gets on the horse and the old coachman is the one who rides with her. He says, it's a wonder to see a woman do so well with that. It's not like you starting 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And you still wouldn't, it basically means you still wouldn't do any of this thing. So Fanny is timid. We can keep registering that and be thinking about why, etc. So this keeps going, right? And for days, Fanny is not getting any exercise until they get back one fine day. And what happens?
When she had to cut the roses out in the sun and then walk to Mrs. Norris's house.
Yeah. And Edmund misses Fanny belatedly. He's full of everything that's been happening. And well, where's Fanny? And Mrs. Norris, Fanny sits up, she's back on the couch, and we get all of that interchange with Mrs. Norris. So what happens in there? She says if Fanny would be more regular in her exercise. So Edmund is suitably abashed, but then it comes out when Mrs. Norris is vying with Lady Bertram about when it happened. Must have been when she was cutting roses in the garden and taking blame. I think there are a lot of italics through here. So what do we learn about Mrs. Norris there, and what's going on here, and what do we learn about Fanny's position in the household?
Well, you know, Fanny is used as an errand girl, and we knew that already because when they were discussing the possibility of her moving to the aunt's house, there was reference to, you know, she's so good at fetching things for me or something, Lady Bertram says. But we see here how extreme it is and how nobody in this house is thinking about what's best for Fanny. Nobody at all. You know, everybody is wrapped up. You know, Lady Bertram is wrapped up in her roses, and you know, Aunt Norris is just vile, and you know, making her go all the way back because she didn't get the key or whatever. And then, you know, and then they blame it on, at least Lady Bertram doesn't blame it on Fanny, but you know, Aunt Norris tries to like make it all Fanny's fault. It's just awful.
Fanny sometimes blames it on Fanny, doesn't she, Susan?
Well, at one point, this is with regard to the visit to Southerton. It says Mrs. Norris has no affection for Fanny and no wish of procuring her pleasure at any time. So she just, and she was the one that encouraged them to take Fanny in, but yet she has absolutely no respect for her or liking for her at all.
Yeah.
Or not only does she not like or respect her, but she doesn't feel responsibility to care for her. And you know, that's her role as an aunt, especially the aunt whose idea it was to bring her in.
Mrs. Norris is one of the evil characters in literature.
Mhm.
So far,
She is
anyway.
not nice.
The last paragraphs often kind of do a little summary and set us up. In the last paragraph of chapter 7, Fanny went to bed with her heart as full as on the first evening of her arrival at the park. The state of her spirits, etc., etc. But then we get down to the bottom. The pain of her mind had been much beyond that in her head, and the sudden change which Edmund's kindness had then occasioned made her hardly know how to support herself. Full gratitude for Edmund despite everything. So we get a little more insight to Fanny and her feelings about Edmund. Okay, we need to move along. In chapter 8, we have the Rushworths stop by to set up the visit to Southerton. And please be thinking, flip through a few pages if you need to. Before we get to the drive, just when they're trying to plan it, how many people are scheming, have interests at stake, and they're trying to turn things in their own direction?
Well, certainly Mariah and Julia
Yeah.
want to be with Mr. Crawford.
And that's a stipulation that
Oh, yes.
we can go if provided Mr. Crawford is able to come. What else?
Mrs. Norris needs to mooch free things off of Southerton.
Have you noticed that Mrs. Norris is pretty unkind about servants sometimes, but she really seeks them out at others?
Oh,
So she's
they
scheming.
even mentioned gossip. Major gossip session. So she's getting the lowdown on what's happening at Southerton from the housekeeper.
Yeah. Also, there's the barouche box. Mrs. Grant even gets into the scheming. Both Mariah and Julia want to sit on the barouche box with Henry Crawford, but Mrs. Grant beats them to the punch. He likes Julia best, you know, and suggests that Julia take it. So everybody has something at stake.
Because Mrs. Grant is promoting that match. She's hoping that her brother will marry Julia. And then, you know, in terms of scheming, there's the overt purpose, the stated purpose of the visit, which
Yes.
is to, make plans for the improvements that he's going to make. And so that's his Mr. Rushworth's scheme. And then, there's the sort of the more subtle stuff of like showing off his place. And his mother is in on that too. And then Henry, is being enlisted to help, but Henry doesn't seem to care at all. And as far as I can tell, never does give any advice at all, even though that's like the stated purpose for the visit.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in just a minute. In getting ready for the drive still, oh, we have all that set up. Then we go through the drive, and Fanny remember Fanny's rapturous at a certain point, and we're beyond her knowledge. She let's see whether I can find that.
She's seen things she's never seen before.
Yeah.
Because she's never been
76.
basically away from
Yep.
Mansfield Park.
Yeah, chapter 8,
Since she was 10.
We were on this page before for the first 7 miles. The paragraph ahead of that, their road was through a pleasant country, and Fanny, whose rides had never been extensive, was soon beyond her knowledge. And what's she enraptured by?
Well, she's genuinely transported by nature, and we see that in various parts in this section. The English countryside, later on when she's stargazing with Edmund, when she just hears about the house and hears about an avenue that's going to be cut down, she thinks about Cooper's poem that like imagines it from the point of view of the trees. So she's definitely embodying this sensibility, the sublimity of nature, in stark contrast to her cousins who don't care at all for it.
We mentioned before with the Cowper, her reading, and we'll have even more evidence of Fanny's reading as we keep going through this. In this paragraph, though, please note, about 10 lines up from the bottom, it only could have been better if Fanny had been able to speak to Edmund about how she felt. That was the only point of resemblance between her and the lady who sat by her. Here's a good piece of narrative commentary. In everything but a value for Edmund, Miss Crawford was very unlike her. She had none of Fanny's delicacy of taste, of mind, of feeling. She saw nature, inanimate nature, with little observation. Her attention was all for men and women, etc. We have a kind of pastoral thing being set up here. English literature is famous for its pastoral settings and gardens. And the English garden, in fact, throughout the 18th century, had become there was a kind of symbolism embedded in the descriptions of landed estates and what we hear from Fanny, and that as a kind of key to women characters' philosophical and ethical schemes, a key to the internal life of the heroine. So kind of keep this in mind. We've had Fanny and Mary overtly put against each other here. There's kind of a country and city kind of thing. So the connotations about gardens have to do with central relationships in sentimental novels and that kind of thing. So keep that in mind, because we'll keep seeing that. Okay.
I was thinking of Sense and Sensibility, and Marianne with her sensibility about nature.
Right, sure. Exactly.
And things like that. But Marianne has a lively mind too. And Fanny doesn't.
Yes.
Well, she
And
doesn't
Mary is
seem to-
charming and witty. Is Fanny charming and witty?
No.
Fanny, are you saying that you think Fanny is rather dull, or that she's just reserved?
She's very reserved. She finds it hard to express herself very well, except when she's with Edmund alone. Otherwise, in company, she does not express herself. It's sort of like Darcy saying to Lizzie Bennet, saying, neither of us express each other well, and ourselves well when we're in company as opposed to when we're with people we know. It's a similar kind of idea.
Yeah. There's so much more to say. Let's scoot to chapter 9, though. 9 and 10 are absolutely crucial in this. And in chapter 10, we have Rushworth receiving his fair lady, almost as though there's a medieval aspect to this. And there was a kind of romanticism about the medieval. And Fanny expresses some of that, especially regarding the chapel.
Oh.
And she's speaking only to Edmund here. Okay, she's in raptures again. Can you find that? It's probably about the bottom second page for me.
Of chapter 9 or 10.
Oh, chapter 9. I'm sorry. Yep, sorry.
And how does the paragraph begin?
Just a second. They entered.
Okay, they entered.
At the bottom of the second page. Fanny's imagination had prepared her for something grander. And then a few lines down, she says to Edmund in a low voice, "I am disappointed, cousin. This is not my idea of a chapel. There's nothing awful here," meaning full of awe. "Nothing melancholy, nothing grand. Here are no aisles, no arches, no inscriptions, no banners." And she quotes Sir Walter Scott, "To be blown by the night wind of heaven, no signs that a Scottish monarch sleeps below." That could almost sound like Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey. And so Edmund pulls her back a little bit. You forget how lately this has been built. And by lately, we're not talking 500 or, within the last 50 years necessarily. But so Fanny's disappointed in the chapel. What's Mary Crawford's response to the chapel? What does she bring up?
Minister.
So she thought,
Homely.
How tedious it must have been to have to sit there and go to services and they forcing them to send the household help to services. She said, "How would you like to have that? You'd rather be sleeping in bed or walking around outside than being dragged to chapel if you were a housemaid or gardener."
And Fanny responds to her. This is just on the next page, a few paragraphs on. Mary Crawford has just said, "Every generation has its improvements."
it's so rude.
Yeah. And it's an ironic note on improvements by Austen here. And Fanny talks back to her. "It's a pity," cried Fanny. Is this the first time we're aware of her really addressing Mary Crawford? So remember, we keep charting when Fanny speaks and to whom. It was a valuable part of former times, etc. And this is when Mary Crawford laughs and talks about the poor housemaids and footmen. And Edmund intervenes. That is hardly Fanny's idea of a family assembling. But then she goes on. Mary Crawford goes on. Fanny is almost too angry for speech. And so take a look at this section if you're not remembering it very well. But then let's get to Julia. About a page and a half on. Julia is just full of life here. And she's really scheming in the chapel to get a leg up over Maria, isn't she? She is talking about seeing them at the altar. Look at Mr. Rushworth and Maria standing side by side, exactly as if the ceremony were going to be performed. And what else does she mention? "It's too bad, Edmund
has not had taken his order."
That's right. Mary Crawford is gobsmacked. Ordained. What, are you to be a clergyman? Now, this doesn't go on too much here. She apologizes, but that is kind of left hanging there. And then we went to the chapel because people were kind of milling around at first. There really wasn't a plan. And now Mrs. Rushworth wants to take them upstairs. And all of the young people walk out a door that they find into a walled garden. There's a beautiful sequence here, but they're all milling around, right? Remember that? Kind of doing their own thing, wandering around the gardens. And finally, there's another open door, but they're go from the house to a walled garden, and then they find another door opened into the wilderness, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
How do we define wildernesses?
It's just a part of
Just
the
a
grounds,
wild
that's
wood.
not really manicured and a proper garden.
That's generally how we would think about it. Wilderness
Left in
can
its
be
natural
something
state.
totally wild, but at this time, the wilderness was the next stage from the walled garden. Everything planned, worked out. And in fact, trees are planted in these wildernesses of the late 18th century, early 19th century, and mostly laurels and larches, in fantastical designs, sometimes in mazes, other kinds of figures. And when we see the kind of meandering that starts in the wilderness, we see it might just as well be a little bit wilder, right? So in fact, in this wilderness, some scholars and critics have noted that Paradise Lost is evoked, that working a pilgrim and the Christian working his way toward paradise, but is tempted in various directions. We're told that, in fact, if there's a snake in this paradise, who is it?
Satan.
Who?
Satan.
Henry.
Henry? Who are you thinking? Who did
I
you
said-
say, Jean?
I said Satan is
Oh,
who we
Satan,
thought of as
yeah. In that
snake.
garden, in Paradise Lost's garden. Here, if there's a serpent, we're told there are serpentine paths, etc. We're not going to push this too hard, but there
No.
are little things dropped in. And yes, Henry Crawford is the one who uses temptation to seduce Mariah, right? Fanny, and notice we've talked about the triangles before. There's a kind of sorting out, even in the walled garden, of Fanny, Mary, and Edmund, and Henry Crawford, Henry Crawford, Miss Mariah, and Mr. Rushworth, and Julia is the one stuck with the two older women. By the time we go into the wilderness, things get a little wilder. They're no longer sticking with triangles, but they start forming couples, right? And how does that shape? How does that happen? Oh, I'm sorry. What I meant to say was it loosens things up first. Mary Crawford feels free to bring up the clergyman discussion again, right? What do you remember about that?
She didn't have much good to say about clergymen and wondered why Edmund
Yeah.
didn't think to do such a thing.
I mean,
Well,
go ahead,
Well, she's just shocking in so many ways. She
Mary.
seems to discount, she seems to discount any possible like sincere religious motivation. She's also so offhanded about like, well, usually there's somebody, some rich relative to like give you an extra estate or something. So I mean, she discounts his financial necessity of having a profession. And she discounts his motivation for like wanting to make people's lives better. And she also, I mean, she discounts his like the strength of his own convictions. She says to him, come on, don't do it, as if like this person who he's known for a month is gonna, she's gonna say, don't be a clergyman, and he'll be like, oh, okay, I won't. So she just doesn't give him any credit at all. It's really shocking.
She's typical of a teenager. She's like a college student who thinks they know absolutely everything and have a very opinionated view of things, and they just tell everybody. There's no filter on her mouth. She just says what she wants when she wants to say it and doesn't care if she offends anyone or not.
And she's generally witty, something, the way she can get off the hook. Susan?
Well, I made a note of one thing she said about clergy, and I think she's also referring to her, is Dr. Grant her uncle or her brother-in-law?
Just a minute. Would you speak up a little? I didn't catch
can you hear me? Okay.
Not as well as we want.
that she mentions that clergymen have less influence in the city than they probably do in the country where Edmund is,
Right.
because there they eat, drink, they're slovenly, selfish, and the curate does all the work.
Yeah, and they cover Mary Crawford. I mean, Edmund talks back to her about that, how a city clergyman is just a preacher, whereas in the countryside, you're in more rural areas, you're setting a model. Fanny enters this, and she's in right at the beginning. In fact, it's paragraph page 86 for me in chapter 9. It's really closer to the end, so back up 4 or 5 pages. And Miss Crawford has just said at the end of the paragraph, so you're to be a clergyman, Mr. Bertram. The paragraph begins, why should it surprise you? You must be designed for, okay, this is the conversation between Mary and Edmund. And about a few small paragraphs down, do you think the church itself never chosen men? Find that?
Mhm.
Never is a black word, but yes, and notice the italics here, but yes, in the never of conversation, which means not very often, I do think. Do you see how, the kinds of exaggerations which are fun? For what is to be done in the church, men love to distinguish themselves. Edmund responds next paragraph, the nothing of conversation has its gradations, I hope, so well as the never. And he talks about why a clergyman can't be fashionable. And Mary starts the next paragraph, you assign greater consequence to the clergyman than one is used to or given. He says back, you are speaking of London. I am speaking of the nation at large. There's this long paragraph then where Edmund is talking, really trying to bring Mary Crawford around. You see the italics farther down? The manners I speak of might rather be called conduct, perhaps, the result of good principles, the effect, in short, of those doctrines which is their duty to teach and recommend. So manners can be interpreted as fashionable or in terms of conduct more seriously here. Fanny says something, certainly is it. It says with gentle earnestness. There, you have quite convinced Miss Price already. And so this goes on a little bit between them. And Fanny, where does Fanny enter? Or is it before? Have I mixed this up? Where she talks about the profession. She talks about someone in the Navy's son going into the Navy. Remember that?
Before, yeah.
Okay.
A soldier would follow his general father, a sailor would follow his admiral father into those various.
Okay, thanks. So that's another evidence of Fanny thinking and contributing to a broader conversation. Now, basically, they get to the ha-ha. Okay, at the end of the wilderness. So we've gone from the stifling house, which has even been described as a prison, to the walled garden. The young adults find a door that they can get out. They find another open door into the wilderness. And then the ones we're following are brought up short by an iron gate. And do you know what a ha-ha is? Do you have a sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
A ha-ha is part of the improvers. Like if you're standing on one hill and you look across to another, but they want to keep the deer out of the wilderness, say, they build a ditch, which has a big fence down the bottom of it. But until you get right on top of it and can look down, you don't see it. So it looks like the landscape just continues on to deer, which are farther out, but it keeps the landscape. So it's all about appearance and keeping cattle out, any recognition of the farming that needs to go on there, et cetera, et cetera. So they get to the locked gate, and Mary Crawford doesn't suggest they squeeze through, as Mariah later does she? What does she suggest? Megan?
Get the key.
Oh,
Yeah.
that they walk along the fence. Okay, so they're go down into the ha-ha and they're going to walk along the fence. And we learn later that somewhere along there they find another iron gate which is open. So there's an unlocked gate. But in the meantime, while Fanny is sitting there waiting, at the locked gate. This actually happens in chapter 10. Let's move to chapter 10, just a couple pages. This is when Mary at the end of chapter 9 suggests that they move along, and Edmund, Fanny says, I'm rested now. And he says, oh, no, 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 no. He urges her to stay. He probably has ulterior motive, right? Then at the beginning of chapter 10, we have Miss Crawford, or Mr. Crawford, Mr. Rushworth, and Maria coming up. And at the fourth paragraph of chapter 10, after some minutes spent this way, Miss Bertram, observing the iron gate, expressed a wish of passing through. What's the next sequence? What happens?
Rushworth goes back to get the key and leaves her there with Crawford.
Mm-hmm. We have
this
What?
whole part feels like a play to me, where Fanny is in one spot. Fanny is just sitting on the bench, and then every other character comes and spends their time. So first it's Henry, or first it's Edmund and Mary, and then they go, and then it's Rushworth and Maria and Henry, and then they convince, and this goes back to your point about couples forming, so Edmund and Mary abandon Fanny and go down into the haha, and then the next three come and they convince Mr. Rushworth to go back and get the key, and now we've got another couple,
Right.
and Maria and Henry are left to squeeze through the gate, and then you get Julia, who's escaped from Mrs. Norris and Mrs. Rushworth.
Yes.
and then she goes, and poor Fanny is just stuck on that freaking bench the whole time. And it's like, yes, she needed a rest, but she never intended to stay there for an hour. And it's so sad because she's the one person who sincerely enjoys seeing nature, sincerely
That's her choice,
wants
isn't
to
it?
see.
She's
Well, it
not
wasn't her
going
choice.
to leave it without Edmund and Mary,
Well,
right?
she really can't. I don't think she has a choice. It's seen as unsafe. I don't think she could go unchaperoned and go follow them or back to the house. I think she feels like she has to stay.
About going to follow them, and that's when she hears Mary's laugh. Look at the fourth paragraph. This is
Can I
this-
just tag on with
short.
Liz's comment about a play? It reminds me of Shakespeare. Think of Midsummer
100%.
Night's Dream and all the confusion that happens in the forest there.
Yep.
Right.
It's the same kind of stuff going on.
It's farcical. Yeah. It's almost farcical at this
In
point.
fact,
It's like early British farce with doors.
What?
It's early British farce with doors.
Yes.
That,
I have massive rain coming down right now.
So do I.
Just
Yeah,
speak up.
I'm looking at the window.
Okay, to this point, that fourth paragraph in chapter 10, after some minutes spent in this way, listen to, this is not free and direct discourse, but it's indirect dialogue that the narrator, Austin, pushes us through really quickly. And you can just imagine it as a dramatic scene with people kind of talking all at once. Miss Bertram, observing the iron gate, expressed a wish of passing through it into the park, that their views and plans might be more comprehensive. It was the very thing of all the others to be wished. It was the best. It was the only way of proceeding with any advantage, in Henry Crawford's opinion. And he directly saw a knoll a mile off, of which would give them exactly the requisite command. So this was what he would be saying. Go therefore, they must to that knoll, and through that gate, but the gate was locked. Mr. Rushworth wished he'd brought the key, had been very near thinking whether he should not bring the key. So we're kind of hearing a really compressed indirect dialogue there, which said,
But you can still kind of hear their voices.
Yeah.
You can picture Rushworth how he would have said that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And then think about design here. Maria edges the way around. Fanny really speaks up. Don't do this. You might wreck your dress, is what she says on a spike. That's been read in very Freudian ways, as you can imagine. But Maria and Henry edge around. Mary doesn't do anything exactly improper, but she almost tempts Edmund to walk away, and they're gone for an hour and a half. And of course, they find another open gate and go into the park, which is where Mary had wanted, or Fanny had wanted to be. So remember, wilderness is actually more designed like a maze. The park has deer, and that's what they want to keep out of the rest of the design things. Julia comes, and I just noticed this on this reading. Julia doesn't get into the park the same way her sister does. She scrambles over the fence, which we're told, anybody who has seen the plan of a ha-ha, the fence is quite something. She probably did record dress. So in that sequence of open door, the locked gate here, Mary and Henry seduces Mariah through that. And we have the unlocked gate where Henry and Mary have been disporting themselves. So everybody except Fanny has had something else going on here. We do have, in this same chapter, we get them home. Okay, so they get back, talk about getting away. And we have the sparring between Mariah and Mrs. Norris in the barouche. And they get, at the end of the paragraph, we're told, very last sentence, their spirits were in general exhausted, and to determine whether the day had afforded most pleasure or pain might occupy the meditations of all. Fanny, at some point, had been going on about the nature, saying there is harmony. Okay, chapter 11. We're not going to do chapter 12 today. It really does belong with the next series of readings and sets it up. But in chapter 11, they're at home. And we really don't hear very much. We get a setup, we're going to expect Sir Thomas home. And third paragraph, there were generally delays, a bad passage or something. Mariah's unhappy, hoping her father will be delayed, of course. But then we have our first triangle, Fanny, Mary, and Edmund standing at an open window in the second page. They are looking out on a twilight scene, and Mary is looking ahead to the father's return. Interesting, when your dad returns, Mariah will be married and you'll be ordained. And so this comes up again, the clergyman stuff. This is where Fanny mentions other professions, the Navy, Army, or whatever is its own justification. So she has really dived in this conversation now in chapter 10. She was kind of tiptoeing around the edges still, or in chapter 11, in chapter 10. So we have conversation again about the clergyman and brothers writing letters. Fanny brings that up. And then Mary is called off to a glee. Edmund admires her going off. Could there be a more, lovely woman? There goes good humor, I am sure. You see that paragraph? It's about second page from the end of the chapter.
To the
There
end
goes
of the chapter?
End of chapter 11.
Okay.
Second page in, paragraph beginning, there goes good humor, I am sure, said he presently. There goes a temper which would never give pain. How well she walks, how readily she falls in with the inclination of others, joining, and for the most part, we've seen Mary want to get her own way, haven't we? In the next paragraph, though, and this is important, we have Fanny waxing eloquent just to Edmund. She's really entered the conversation when Mary was involved, but here it's just to Edmund. And she, paragraph that says Fanny agreed to it halfway through. Fanny spoke her feelings in the deep shade of the woods. Here's harmony, said she. Here's repose. You see it? Here's what may leave all painting and all music behind, and what poetry only can attempt to describe. What does Fanny read predominantly?
Poetry.
Poetry. Here's what may tranquilize every care and lift the heart to rapture. So Fanny, when she comes out of herself, especially in these natural settings, is capable of some real feeling, this rapture. When I look out on such a night as this, I feel as if there could be neither wickedness nor sorrow in the world. And there certainly would be less of both if the sublimity of nature were more attended to, and people were carried more out of themselves by contemplating such a scene. Edmund immediately thinks of Mary and the fact that her education has not set her up to feel such a thing. Then Fanny flatters Edmund, saying, "You taught me to think and feel in the subject, cousin." And he knows there's Arcturus looking very bright. Yes, and the bear. I wish I could see Cassiopeia. We must go out on the lawn for that. They don't, do they?
Mm-mm.
Edmund says he will, but then he starts listening to the glee. As soon as this glee is finished, at the end, Fanny sighs alone at the window till scolded away by Mrs. Norris's threats of catching cold.
Such a
And-
sad sentence.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to back us up. This, we will hear about allusions to Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, in the next, in chapter 13. Here, I propose that whether it's part of Fanny's reading or not, I suspect that it might have been, but that word or phrase, "on such a night as this," just echoes with two lovers in the Merchant of Venice. Jessica, the Jew's daughter, has run off with all of his money to become a Christian and take off with the Christian that she loves. Lorenzo starts, "The moon shines bright in such a night as this." And he says, "Troilus methinks." Okay, there are these classical allusions to Troilus thinking of Cressida, classical lovers. Jessica answers, "In such a night did Thisbe overtrip the dew," etc. Lorenzo, "In such a night stood Dido with a willow in her hand upon the wild sea banks and waft her love to come again to Carthage. In such a night, Medea gathered the enchanted herbs." And then Lorenzo, and this is a more witty couple than Fanny would be, but "In such a night did Jessica steal from the wealthy Jew, with an unthrift love did run from Venice as far as Belmont. In such a night did young Lorenzo swear he loved her well, stealing her soul with many vows of faith, and ne'er a true one." So they're teasing each other here. "In such a night did pretty Jessica slander her love." And Jessica says, "I would outnight you did nobody come, but here's somebody approaching." What's really important here in this movement is that they move from the classical examples to themselves. That's pretty much what Fanny does, isn't it? "In such a night as this, I wish I could see Cassiopeia," but she knows is out on the lawn. So she's trying to move Edmund, perhaps. I mean, this is my reading. Think about it. Out onto the lawn, getting them a little further away from everyone else. I see it almost as Fanny making a little bit of a move. And of course, it doesn't work. Edmund
Not
stayed
yet.
in.
Not
Yeah.
yet.
So, okay, it's 8 o'clock. We've covered ground. What's left hanging that's annoying you? Or just something unclear, or you think we didn't cover well enough?
Am I the only one that when you think of Mr. Rushworth, you think of Harris Bigwither?
Maybe. Do you
Yeah.
know who Harris Bigwither? Tell us who Harris Bigwither is.
So when Jane was 27, Harris
Oh.
Bigwither was 21, and he proposed marriage to her. She said yes. She slept on it and then said no, thank you. And she just was not happy after she said yes. And for whatever reason, that happened in 1802, and then she finished Mansfield Park sometime after June 1813. And I don't know, for some reason, I just picture Mr. Rushworth as Harris Bigwither.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
has
Austen
money, but meh.
Austen goes through a lot of romances, would-be romances, almost romances in all of her novels. And clearly she's drawing on some personal experiences and her sisters and everybody around her. But yes, I thought of Harris Bigwither also. Mr. Rushworth
And that's
is
a great
slow,
point
large
to-
man. Liz?
I was just going to say that's a great point to bring up because it emphasizes that Mariah is not stuck with Mr. Rushworth as she doesn't want to be.
We'll learn more about that in the next, in chapter
Yeah.
13, or no,
Later,
we'll learn
that
more
comes
about
later.
that later. Yeah.
But knowing that, I mean, I know what happens in the novel, but I don't think we see a lot of examples in Austen of people accepting a proposal and then backing out. But that's just a reminder that it wasn't not done, like it could be done.
And let's keep that in mind as we go along. Anything, other things, loose ends, oddities, befuddlements.
I'm sorry I missed the first, few minutes again tonight, but I guess there must have been something about Fanny not speaking up much so far. But I think I've just been thinking about this as we've been talking, that I think we can't misread Fanny's lack of having a extroverted voice for having a really intuitive internal knowledge of what's going on, and also general understanding of everybody. Like, I think she reads everyone so much better than they see themselves. So I think this last scene with her and Edmund in the stars, I think she has a subtle way of saying to Edmund, I see you. Miss Crawford doesn't see who you really are, but I see you. And she's trying to get him to see that about her. I think we see her work that angle a lot in this section, but even going forward, I think she doesn't ever come out and say, I love you, but I think she is steering him in a direction. And also you see in this section exactly how Miss Crawford Edmund isn't what Miss Crawford wants, but also Miss Crawford isn't what Edmund wants either. They're not seeing each other as they really are. They're seeing each other as they want each other to be. Both of them are making that mistake. And I think Fanny sees that so clearly.
I agree with Melissa. And we have to remember that Fanny reads a lot.
Yes.
She quotes poetry. She quotes the intellectuals of the day. And she has integrated that knowledge in a way that she can quote it correctly. And she can make comments that are astute, even if there's just a few of them. And she's not necessarily recognized because she's so quiet and she's fading into the sofa and she takes care of Mrs. Bertram, Lady Bertram, but she's watching all the time. By not being engaged with others, she's watching and she's waiting, as Melissa's saying, she's waiting for the moment that she can jump in, that the triangle has a opening.
Yeah. And she's been prompted more and more to speak. We were told she was outright angry at one point. I don't think she speaks then, but she's speaking a little bit more as we go along. We'll chart that. But Melissa, did you come in when we were talking about free and direct discourse?
Right. You guys were kind of wrapping that up right when I was coming in. Yeah.
Because that's directly to your point. We are privy to Fanny's interior life, which most of the other characters don't really have a clue about. Liz?
We are, and yet I think the narrator really withholds naming Fanny's feelings for Edmund. Like, there's hints. There's like one spot, and I don't remember what page it is, but there's one spot where the narrator says, but because they couldn't know what her heart was, whatever. The narrator alludes to the fact that there's more feeling there than is being acknowledged. But it's one of the things I'm very curious about in this book is why is the narrator so reticent about Fanny's feelings for Edmund? We can infer them. Well, I think the answer is more complicated than that. I guess what makes me curious is why, and this isn't like a yes/no question or a question I expect anyone to answer, but I'm so intrigued by how that affects our reading, and because it's not like we don't know it. It's not like the narrator is hiding something, or if the narrator's hiding it, she's hiding it in plain sight. And yet, and the narrator will name other feelings, but the narrator does not name that feeling And I have a theory about why that is, but we can talk
Okay,
about that
well,
later.
yeah, we
Me too.
will. Laura, did you have something to say?
I had some, it was in chapter 7. There actually was when they were talking about what Fanny and Edmund both think of Mary Crawford.
Mhm.
And it was nice that they agree with it. She said, having formed her mind and gained her affections, it was not surprising that she would agree on that. And I was surprised that already in chapter 7 there was a little hint about that. I think it should
But
have
as he was her mentor. Also,
Yeah.
you might just even page through this whole section. It's amazing what a good skim, what will catch your eye, just what your eye lands on as you page through, leaf
Mhm.
through. And you will find, we did not really land on this or talk about it much, but there are a couple of times when Fanny, we're getting her sense, we're interior, indirect discourse or however, we're into her mind, but she questions it. She doesn't she doesn't jump to conclusions. She's really pretty careful. And because of her affection for Edmund, she is willing to think she's wrong about something. So in this section, that's kind of where it is, though she's taking more and more steps toward more definite attitudes. Okay, we really have to sign off, but thank you. Some really good observations. Let's carry all of that we'll start briefly with chapter 12 next time and go through 18, the end of volume 1. I want to tell you though, that right now we're a quarter of the way through the novel. And that I always note those things. Oh, and I know where dead center is. And I know that today's authors have word counts that they're reaching. They know where crisis point needs to be. I don't know whether Jane Austen planned it that way, but it's kind of interesting to me. Okay. See you next time. Great. Lovely.
you.
Thank you so much.